The city at night, from the 72nd floor, was not a tapestry of lights but a circuit board of power. Down there, in the grid of streets, debts were collected in blood and alleys whispered with fear. Up here, in the penthouse that crowned the Moretti Tower, the air was silent and cold, smelling of polished marble and absolute control. This was the sanctum of Vic Moretti, and within it, every beautiful object had a price, a purpose, and an owner. Anya became an object on a Tuesday. Her entrance was not marked by ceremony but by a quiet, devastating transaction. Her father's gambling debt, a number that had swollen like a sickness, was erased with a single stroke of Vic's pen. In return, she was brought upstairs, her old life ending with the smooth sigh of the elevator doors. She stood in the vast living room, not as a guest, but as acquired property. Vic did not look at her face first. His gaze, dark and assessing, traveled from her simple shoes to the nervous hands clasped before her, a curator inspecting a new piece. "You will stay here," he said, his voice a low vibration in the stillness. "You will be available. Your family's comfort depends on your compliance." The word hung in the air, heavier than any lock. Her new world was a paradox of luxury and confinement. A suite of rooms with a breathtaking, terrifying view, a closet filled with clothes that were not her style but suited his taste, silks, cashmeres, fabrics that felt like a whisper against the skin he now owned. Her purpose was amorphous, defined solely by his whims. Sometimes she was a silent attendant, pouring whiskey for men whose eyes slid over her as if she were a lamp. Other times, she was a decorative presence, instructed to sit by the fireplace and read while he conducted business, a living sculpture of obedience. The molestation was not a singular, violent event, but a slow, corrosive atmosphere. It was in the way he would correct the drape of her dress, his fingers lingering on her hip bone, cool and possessive. It was the command to turn for him in a new gown, his stare a physical weight that measured and judged. He would often call her to his study late at night, not for any task, but to stand by his chair as he worked, his hand occasionally reaching out to absently twirl a strand of her hair around his finger, as one might fidget with a trinket. The violation was in its casual certainty, in the absolute assumption of access. He would guide her through a room with a palm pressed to the small of her back, a gesture that looked gentlemanly but felt like a brand, searing through the fabric. He never struck her, never raised his voice beyond a calm, chilling register. His power was so complete it needed no violence, only the relentless reminder of her place. She was a doll in a gilded case, taken out to be admired, adjusted, and handled. Days bled into weeks, each one sanding down a layer of her former self. The vibrant girl from a life before grew pale and quiet, her reflections in the endless windows becoming ghostlier. She learned to mute her movements, to soften her breaths, to make herself a placid, empty surface. The ember of her spirit didn't die, however. It retreated, buried deep beneath the layers of humiliation and fear, transforming into something else, something hard, sharp, and patient. She watched, because that was all she could do. She watched the routines of the guards, the pattern of the security system's disarm code, the names on documents left carelessly open. She stored every detail in the cold, secret vault of her mind, even as her body obeyed his every subtle command. The breaking was a quiet thing. It happened one evening as he received a massage in his private suite. He summoned her to fetch a cigar. As she entered, the masseuse was dismissed. Vic lay on the table, a king on his slab, and gestured for her to come closer. "The humidor," he said, his eyes closed. She fetched it, her hand steady. When she presented it, his hand closed not around the box, but around her wrist. His skin was warm. "Stay," he murmured, a non-negotiable decree. For an hour, she stood there, holding a box of cigars, while he rested, her arm aching, her soul screaming in silent, trapped humiliation. In that endless hour, as she stared at a flaw in the marble floor, the last soft part of her calcified. The hatred, once a faint glow, crystallized into a diamond-sharp purpose. He saw a doll finally accepting its place on the shelf. He did not see the prisoner meticulously mapping the locks of her cage. The gilded walls felt closer than ever, but within Anya, a plan began to form in the dark, a single, focused thought, to watch, to learn, and one day, to ruin the hand that held her leash. The air in Vic Moretti's private dining room was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and implicit threat. A week had passed since the incident in the massage room, and Anya's performance of subdued acquiescence had become flawless. She was a specter in silk, her movements silent, her eyes perpetually lowered to a spot just beyond the shine of her own reflection in the polished table. Vic, emboldened by her apparent capitulation, had begun to treat her less as a potentially fractious possession and more as an extension of his own will, a beautiful, mute appendage. This hubris, this belief in his own absolute dominion, was the first critical fissure in his armor. He decided to bring her to a meeting. It was not a routine gathering, but a tense negotiation with the Volkov Syndicate, a rival organization with a reputation for brutality that even made Vic's men tread carefully. The venue was a members-only club, all dark wood and leather, smelling of old money and older cigars. Anya was positioned not at the table, but in a plush armchair slightly behind Vic's right shoulder, a living ornament. "You will sit. You will be still. You will listen to nothing," he had instructed her, his fingers tilting her chin up to meet his gaze, a gesture that was both intimate and despotic. She had nodded, the very picture of docility. For the first hour, she was a statue. The men, Vic, his consigliere Silas, and the two stone-faced Volkov brothers, parceled out territories and percentages, their voices a low, gruff symphony of power. Anya's gaze remained fixed on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug, her mind a perfect, receptive blank. Then, as the conversation hit a stalemate over the control of the northern docks, Vic grew restless. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, and his hand dropped casually to the side. His fingers found the bare skin of Anya's knee, exposed by the slit of the dress he had chosen for her. His touch was warm, proprietary. He did not look at her. His attention was on Ivan Volkov, who was lighting a fat cigar. But his thumb began to move, tracing a slow, idle circle on her kneecap. It was a gesture of profound contempt, not for her, but for the men across the table. It was a display. See what I own. See how little it concerns me. My attention is here, on our business, while my possession is here, beneath my hand. The humiliation was a white-hot brand, searing through the numbness she had cultivated. Yet, Anya did not flinch. She did not breathe. She became a vessel, and into that vessel, she poured every shred of her focus away from the violation on her skin and into the words swirling in the air around her. As Vic's touch grew more deliberate, his fingers drifting higher under the fabric of her dress, he leaned slightly toward Silas and murmured a number, a security bypass code for a waterfront warehouse. He said it softly, confident the Volkovs couldn't hear. Anya, her hearing sharpened by adrenaline, caught it. Ivan Volkov, scowling, mentioned a shipping container, citing its identifier, Kestrel 7 Alpha. Vic, his hand now gripping her thigh with a firm, possessive pressure, argued a point about customs officials, letting slip the name of a compromised agent, Marlowe. Each piece of information, each careless secret, was dropped like a bead into the silent, receptive bowl of Anya's mind. She saw the ledger, too, left open beside Vic's elbow as he reached for his glass. It was not the numbers she noted, but the unusual symbol at its header, a stylized hawk with a key in its talon, the logo of an offshore bank she recognized from a financial report left in his study. The meeting concluded with tense handshakes and unresolved tensions. The ride back to the penthouse was silent. Vic seemed pleased, energized by the confrontation. He looked at her as one might look at a lucky charm that had performed its silent duty. Back in the penthouse's stark silence, the energy curdled. The performative cruelty of the club gave way to something more personal, more demanding. In the moonlit expanse of the master bedroom, his earlier display of ownership morphed into an assertion of deeper conquest. His hands were not idle now, they were specific, his kisses not possessive but consuming. It was a stark, wordless reclamation, a reminder that her body was the canvas upon which his will was the only law. She endured it as she had endured everything, by retreating to that inner vault, where the cold, hard ember of her hatred was now fanned into a steady, guiding flame. Later, as Vic slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who believes he owns the very night, Anya slipped from the bed. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette against the city's glow, the ghost of his touch still upon her skin. The humiliation was no longer a passive weight, it was a catalyst, a chemical agent transforming pain into pure, volatile purpose. The information from the meeting cycled in her mind, the code, the container, the name, the symbol. Moving with a silence born of months of practice, she went to his study. The tablet was on his desk, its screen dark. She had seen him enter the passcode 100 times, the date his father died, a morbid sentimentality she had noted with clinical disgust. She keyed it in. The device awoke, a portal to his empire. Her heart was a hammer against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Guided by the fragments she had collected, she navigated. She found the shipping logs and flagged Kestrel 7 Alpha for a customs inspection. She accessed the financial records using the Hawkan key symbol, initiating a complex series of microtransfers designed to trigger fraud algorithms. She sent an anonymous, encrypted tip about Agent Marlowe to a federal watchdog address she had memorized from a discarded memo. Finally, she compiled a list of encrypted email addresses for the Volkovs' main rivals and attached a heavily redacted, but incriminating, page from the digital ledger. Each action was a stone dropped into a still pond. She knew the ripples would converge into a tidal wave. She did not feel triumph. She felt a profound, chilling clarity. With a final, decisive tap, she erased her digital footprints as best she could, placed the tablet exactly as she found it, and walked back through the silent penthouse. She did not take a coat. She did not look back at the bedroom where her tormentor slept. She simply stepped into the private elevator, descended through the heart of his tower, and walked out into the pre-dawn chill, the first gray light of morning staining the sky. She left behind the gilded cage, the lingering scent of his cologne, and the broken doll. What moved into the awakening city was something else entirely, a ghost, a creditor, a woman who had just lit a fuse to a mountain of dynamite and was walking calmly away from the coming blast. The collapse of Victor Moretti's world did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with a series of quiet, administrative ticks. The first sign was the frozen accounts. A scheduled payment to a lieutenant in Sicily failed, not due to lack of funds, but because of a federal lien placed so deftly that not even his alert financial man saw it coming. Then, the silence. The usual stream of encrypted messages on his secure line slowed to a trickle, then ceased altogether. Men who had been fixtures in his penthouse, their laughter booming off the marble, became ghosts. Their phones rang out into voicemails that would never be answered. Vic, a man whose intuition was honed in back alleys and boardrooms, felt the tectonic shift before he saw the cracks in the walls. He stood at his window, the same view that had once symbolized dominion, and felt a profound, unsettling hollow where certainty had been. The first physical blow came at the docks. Kestrel 7 Alpha, a container holding not the promised textiles but a small arsenal and $2 million in untraceable bearer bonds, was seized by a joint task force. The operation was too precise, too informed to be routine. Someone had sung a very specific song. The bonds were gone, the weapons impounded, and 3 of his most loyal port men were in federal custody before breakfast. Chaos, once a foreign concept in his meticulously ordered kingdom, began to spread like a stain. The news about Agent Marlowe broke in the afternoon edition of the Financial Press, a sidebar note about a corruption investigation that toppled a long-respected customs official. This was a direct blow to his logistics, a vital artery severed. Then came the whispers from the streets, carried by panicked soldiers with fear in their eyes. The Volkovs, smelling blood in the water and enraged by what they saw as a deliberate setup at the docks, were moving. Not with subtlety, but with brutal, overwhelming force. A lucrative sports book operation was firebombed. 2 collections men were found in an alley, their bodies bearing the distinctive, cruel signatures of Volkov enforcers. Worst of all was the betrayal from within. The leaked ledger details, sent to the Scorpioni family, a smaller but vicious outfit hungry for a promotion, unleashed a corporate-style raid. They didn't go for muscle, they went for clients. Long-standing arrangements with politicians, judges, and union heads were abruptly cancelled, the contacts citing new partnerships with a chilling uniformity. Vic's empire wasn't being toppled by a war, it was being meticulously dismantled, its pillars pulled out one by unseen hands. His own organization, built on loyalty enforced by fear, now buckled under that same fear. Rats, sensing the ship was doomed, began to leap. Silas, his consigliere for 15 years, was found in his study, a single bullet in his temple and a pile of incinerated documents in the fireplace. He had chosen a cleaner exit than the one waiting for him. Within a month, the penthouse was a tomb. The staff had been dismissed. The art, the wine, the trappings of immense wealth remained, but they were just empty shells. The power had bled out. Vic sat alone in the vast living room, the silence of physical presence. The FBI had frozen every asset they could find. The rivals had taken the rest. He was a king without a country, a general without an army, reduced to a final, burning realization that circled his mind like a vulture. Only one person had been in the room for every misstep, had heard every careless word, had the access and, most importantly, the motive. Anya. The name was no longer that of a possession. It was a curse, a puzzle, and the epicenter of his rage. His obsession, once a cold ownership, transformed into something molten and singular. He didn't just want revenge, he needed to stand before her and understand how a creature he had broken had engineered such a masterful ruin. He needed to see the intelligence in her eyes, to reclaim, if only for a moment, the narrative she had stolen from him. Using the last of his untraceable cash and calling in a final, mortal favor from a pilot who owed him a life, he began his hunt. He became a ghost himself, moving through the crumbling infrastructure of his former life, following a trail she had tried very hard not to leave. He found her not in some distant metropolis, but in a quiet, salt-scrubbed town on the coast, a place of gulls and fog and forgetfulness. She had rented a small, shingled cottage overlooking a rocky beach. From a distance, through binoculars, he watched her. She looked different. Her hair was longer, tossed by the wind. She wore simple jeans and a thick sweater, and she walked the shoreline every afternoon, her gaze on the horizon, not on her surroundings. She had found a kind of peace, a numb, tentative survival. She believed herself free. She believed him finished. He watched her for 2 days, studying her routines, the isolation of the cottage, the rhythm of the tides. The cold fury in his chest did not abate, but it refined itself into a sharp, patient point. On the evening of the 3rd day, as a thick fog rolled in from the sea, muffling the world in gray, he made his move. He entered the cottage with the ease of a man who had once owned locksmiths. He was in her living room, a shadow against the fading light from the window, when she returned from her walk, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The door clicked shut behind her. She turned, and she saw him. The color drained from her face, not with the old, familiar fear, but with a stunned, cosmic disbelief. The teacup she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the wooden floor, the sound explosively loud in the quiet. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the architect of ruin and the ruined king. He saw the woman, not the doll. He saw the fierce, terrifying intelligence now unhidden in her wide eyes. She saw the gauntness in his face, the hunted look, the expensive coat now frayed at the cuffs. All his power was gone, but the danger radiating from him was more potent than ever, distilled to its essence. He took a step forward, his voice a low rasp that carried across the room, devoid of its old command but heavy with a new, deadly promise. "You took everything from me." He stated it as a fact, his gaze pinning her where she stood. "But you made one mistake. You left me alive. And you belong to me. You're coming back. And you will tell me why. You will explain every single step of what you did." He did not grab her. He didn't need to. The threat, and the terrifying history between them, was chains enough. The walls of her fragile, hard-won sanctuary closed in, not with gold leaf this time, but with the dark, inescapable shadow of the man she had tried to destroy. The game had not ended with her escape. It had simply entered a new, more desperate phase. The journey was a blur of grim silence and punishing motion. Vic drove through the night, his stolen sedan devouring miles of dark highway, putting as much distance as possible between them and the coastal town. Anya sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the painted lines vanish beneath the car. She did not speak. She did not plead. The shock had been replaced by a glacial clarity. He was no longer an untouchable sovereign, he was a fugitive, and he had just made himself her captor again. The power dynamic, while still lethally skewed, had fundamentally altered. The cage had shrunk, but so had the giant who held the key. Their destination was a forgotten place, a hunting lodge deep in the dense, snow-dusted pine forests of a mountain range that straddled a state border. It was a property from his father's era, rustic and raw, its existence scrubbed from most records. The air inside was frigid, smelling of damp wood and old ashes. Vic lit a fire in the massive stone hearth, the flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to wrestle with the darkness of the room. This was not a gilded cage, this was a wolf's den. His interrogation began not with violence, but with a terrifying, focused intensity. He paced before the fire, a panther in worn leather, his questions sharp and precise. He did not ask if she had done it, he demanded the how. "The ledger," he began, his voice a low scrape against the crackle of the fire. "You saw it for 30 seconds. You don't have an eidetic memory. How did you know which bank? Which account?" She met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the firelight. Her voice, when it came, was steady, devoid of its old tremor. "The header. A hawk with a key. It was on a charity donation receipt from 6 months ago. The Haven Rock Foundation. You donated to a bird sanctuary. I looked it up. It was a shell for a private bank in Luxembourg." She recited the account number prefix. Vic stopped pacing. His fury was momentarily eclipsed by a stark, unwilling admiration. She had not just seen, she had connected. This pattern repeated over the following days. He would press, circling a specific point of the collapse. She would answer, her explanations cold, technical, and devastatingly intelligent. She spoke of algorithms, of trigger points in banking software, of the psychological profiles of the rival families that made the Volkovs the perfect, reactive weapon. She was dissecting her own act of vengeance with the calm of a surgeon. Each revelation was a twist of the knife in his pride. His empire hadn't fallen to a rival's strength or federal might, it had been deconstructed by the quiet, observant mind of the woman he had considered a beautiful piece of furniture. The atmosphere in the lodge became a volatile compound of hatred and a perverse, grinding fascination. They were locked in a brutal dance of wills. He would try to reassert the old dominance, his hands gripping her arms, his face inches from hers as he demanded another detail. But the old fear was gone. She would not look away. "You taught me to observe, Vic," she said one evening, her voice cutting through the tension. "You taught me that every detail matters. You just never thought the lesson would apply to you." The truth of it hung in the cold air, more humiliating than any insult. In the confined, primal space of the lodge, something else began to smolder. The line between hatred and a devastating, unwanted attraction blurred in the heat of their constant confrontation. It was in the way their arguments left them both breathless and charged, standing too close in the cramped kitchen. It was in the way his eyes, once full of dismissive ownership, now tracked her with a searing focus that saw her, the formidable adversary he had created. For Anya, it was the horrifying realization that the man beneath the monster was scarred, sharp, and tragically coherent, a dark mirror of her own brokenness. The connection was a sickening knot of shared trauma and mutual, grudging respect. The shift from psychological warfare to physical consummation was as inevitable as it was catastrophic. It happened after a particularly brutal verbal clash over the fate of Silas. The air was electric with rage and a raw, unfiltered pain. He moved toward her, not to strike, but to dominate with his presence. She didn't retreat. She stepped into him. What followed was not the violation of the penthouse, it was a collision. It was consensual, but it was a battle, a violent, desperate negotiation between two enemies who understood each other's scars better than anyone else ever could. It was passion forged in hatred and tempered by a dark, lonely recognition. Afterward, lying in the chill of the dusty bedroom, the silence between them was not peaceful, but profoundly changed. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. This fragile, explosive détente shattered with the sound of an engine cutting through the mountain silence. Vic was at the window in an instant, peeling back the crude blanket serving as a curtain. Two black SUVs, not official but ominously professional, were navigating the overgrown track toward the lodge. The Scorpioni family, it seemed, had decided to clean up loose ends themselves. He had been betrayed, his location sold. "Get to the cellar," he hissed, shoving a pistol into her hands. His eyes were pure, tactical ice. "The hatch under the rug in the bedroom. Don't come out." Anya stared at the weapon, then at him. The orders came in a rapid-fire burst as he moved to barricade the door. But she didn't move. She watched as the SUVs disgorged 6 armed men. She saw Vic take a position, his profile grim and accepting. He was going to fight, and he was going to die, buying seconds for a ghost to disappear. As the first shot splintered the front door, something in her fractured and realigned. Letting the Scorpionis take him was not freedom, it was delivery into the hands of men who would make Vic's past cruelties look like child's play. And the part of her now inextricably, terribly bound to him rebelled. As he fired through the window, drawing their fire, Anya did not flee to the cellar. She moved to the back kitchen window, slipped out into the biting cold, and circled around the side of the lodge, using the roar of the gunfire as cover. She came up behind a Scorpione soldier who was about to toss a grenade through the shattered front window. She didn't hesitate. The pistol report was shockingly loud. The man fell. Her intervention created chaos, a split-second diversion. Vic saw her, a wraith in the trees, and in that moment, his cold strategy broke. He burst from the side door, grabbing her arm, and they ran, not into the woods, but to an old, camouflaged snowmobile shed he'd noted upon arrival. A minute later, with bullets tearing through the trees around them, the ancient snowmobile erupted from the shed in a cloud of smoke and noise, carrying them deeper into the wilderness. He was bleeding heavily from a graze on his temple and a worse wound in his side, his weight slumping against her as she drove blindly into the white void. They crashed in a snowdrift miles later, the machine dead. Anya, her own body screaming with adrenaline, dragged him into the lee of a rocky outcrop. The hunter was now the wounded. The captive was now the savior. In the blinding white silence, she used strips of her own sweater to staunch his wounds, her hand steady, her mind eerily calm. He looked up at her, his vision swimming, the blood loss stripping away his defenses. "Why?" he rasped, the word a cloud of vapor in the freezing air. She met his gaze, her face pale and smudged with dirt and his blood. She didn't have an answer, or perhaps she had too many. She had not saved the man who owned her. She had saved the only other person who understood the price of the ashes they'd both risen from. The line between victim and protector had not just blurred, it had been obliterated. They were something new now, something born in ruin and bound by a debt of blood that flowed in both directions, out here in the frozen, indifferent wild. The world distilled itself to a monochrome palette of white snow, gray rock, and the startling, vital crimson of blood. Vic Moretti's consciousness flickered like a weak flame in the wind, tethered to the brutal reality of pain by the persistent, determined pressure of Anya's hands. She worked with a methodical precision that was devoid of tenderness yet brimming with a fierce, unwavering intent. He would not die. Not here. Not by the hands of scavengers. The cold was a silent, creeping adversary, but it was no match for the furnace of her resolve. She fashioned a crude sled from pine branches and the torn shell of the snowmobile, harnessing herself to it with straps of webbing. Then she began to walk, dragging the weight of him and their shared, bloody history deeper into the wilderness, away from the roads, the hunters, and the ghosts of their past lives. They found shelter in the skeletal remains of a trapper's cabin, long abandoned to the elements. For 3 days, Vic hovered in a feverish purgatory, haunted by phantoms of his own fallen empire and the piercing, green-eyed ghost who had destroyed it. Anya was his only anchor. She melted snow for water, forced bits of concentrated rations past his lips, and cleaned his wounds with melted snow and the last of a stolen bottle of whiskey. Her touch was clinical, efficient, but her vigilance was absolute. She slept in fitful bursts, the pistol always within reach, listening to the howl of the wind and his ragged breathing. In his lucid moments, he watched her, this woman who had every reason to let the winter claim him, or to simply put a bullet in his temple and be truly free. The question of why hung between them, unanswered, a third presence in the frigid cabin. When the fever broke, he was weak as a kitten, his formidable strength reduced to the ability to sit up and sip broth. The dynamic was irrevocably shifted. He was her patient. She held his survival in her hands as surely as she once held the digital codes to his ruin. They spoke, not as captor and captive, but as two survivors of the same cataclysm. The conversations were stripped bare, raw nerves exposed to the cold air. He spoke of his father, not the legend, but the brutal man who had taught him that love was a liability and mercy a fatal flaw. She spoke of the hollow, echoing silence that had followed her vengeance, the emptiness of freedom when it was built upon such utter desolation. They did not forgive. They understood. They recognized in each other the same deep, fundamental damage, the same capacity for cold calculation, the same stubborn, unkillable will to persist. As his strength slowly returned, so did the dangerous, magnetic tension. It was different now. There was no power to assert, no performance of ownership. What grew between them in that isolated space was a dark, mutual claiming. Their physical reunions were intense, wordless conversations, a grappling not for dominance but for a desperate, visceral affirmation that they were both still alive, still feeling, amidst the wreckage. It was a communion of shadows, passionate and fraught, an addiction forged in shared trauma. He would trace the scar on her wrist from a long-ago accident in his penthouse kitchen, and she would press her palm against the freshly healing wound on his side, a silent testament to her choice in the snow. They were mapping each other's ruins, finding a perverse solace in the familiarity of the scars. The outside world, however, had not forgotten them. Through a carefully concealed satellite phone Vic retrieved from a hidden compartment in his boots, his final card to play, they accessed whispers from the underworld. The Scorpiones, emboldened, had absorbed the last of his viable operations. The Volkovs, unsatisfied, had put a bounty on both their heads, a price for the chaos she had unleashed and the insult of his survival. They were not just targets, they were a loose end that threatened the new, uneasy order. Their survival now hinged on a simple, brutal equation: alone, they were prey; together, they might become predators once more. It was Anya who voiced the pact, one evening as the northern lights shimmered in a ghostly dance outside the cracked window. "They won't stop," she said, her voice calm. "They want you dead to erase the past. They want me dead to erase the proof that a ghost can burn a kingdom. We are each other's only ally." She turned to him, her face a study in stark determination. "I will help you rebuild. Not an empire. A shadow. Something smarter, leaner, and utterly untouchable. I will be your strategist, your ghost in the machine." She paused, the weight of her demand hanging in the air. "In return, you give me a partnership. Not ownership. Equality. My freedom is non-negotiable. And your loyalty, Vic, your absolute, unwavering loyalty, is mine, as mine will be yours. We rise from these ashes together, or we perish in them alone." He looked at her, this phoenix he had tried to break who had instead forged herself in his fire. He saw not the broken doll, not the vengeful wraith, but the only equal he had ever encountered. He saw their future, a dark syndicate of two, built on a foundation of mutual destruction and a bond more twisted and strong than any vow. He held out his hand, not to take, but to seal. "No more cages," he said, the words a vow. "Just shadows." The final scene finds them not in a penthouse, but on the roof of an unremarkable building in a city they do not name, weeks later. They stand shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the glittering grid of power below. They are clothed in dark, unremarkable fabrics, ghosts amidst the light. Anya's hair is pulled back, severe and practical. Vic's posture is no longer that of a king holding court, but of a sentinel, sharp and watchful. A phone buzzes silently. Anya glances at it, a faint, cold smile touching her lips. The first phase of their counteroffensive, a digital ghost she set loose, has just begun. He looks at her profile, not with possession, but with a profound, deadly respect. They are no longer a boss and his toy. They are a phoenix and her shadow, an alliance forged in revenge and sealed in blood, ready to reclaim their destiny from the ashes, on their own terms. The game has not ended. It has simply evolved, and the board is now the entire world. If you've journeyed through the dark, twisted bond of Anya and Vic, and want to witness the brutal, passionate world they build from the ashes, ensure you don't miss a chapter of their story. Subscribe for notifications of future works in this dark, compelling universe where enemies become equals and love is forged in the fires of vengeance.